Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 8 for season 9. Now, this episode was recorded on Saturday, the 6th of July, 2019, for a broadcast on the 24th of July. This episode is sponsored by TripleByte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. I'm Dru Freeman here with my ever early rising season 9 co-host, Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Dru. On this episode, we will be talking with Hadi Hariri. Hadi is a very active Twitter member. Originally from Iran, naturalized Spaniard living in Spain, a Kotlin developer advocate, a guy with lots of experience. Developer and creator of many things OSS, he has been programming in one way, shape, or form since the age of 12. He's the author of various publications and courses. Hadi has been speaking at industry events for nearly 2 decades. Host to Talking Kotlin, he works at JetBrains, leading the developer advocacy team, and spends as much time as he can writing code.
In this episode, Hadi will discuss Kotlin and some developer advocacy with us. Then in the second half, Jenn will talk about her favorite Android Studio shortcuts. Hadi, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be on.
So I can appreciate this because I got my first computer when I was 11, 12. You started at 12?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, started programming at 12 is an overstatement a little bit. It makes my bio look great, but I think at 12, it was like, 10 print hello, 20 go to 10.
What was your system?
My first computer was the Amstrad CPC 464, which was, I don't know if you remember the Spectrum time, the Spectrum 48Ks. And the Commodores. So it was around the same time, an Amstrad system.
Okay, I remember the Commodores because I was an Apple II person, so I also started on the 10 print 20s.
Yeah. So this was back, I think it was 1985, 86 or something like that. I can't remember.
So we're about the same time period.
Yeah.
Me too. I started with the Commodore 64, same time period.
Yeah, so I was when the Commodore was the one I really wanted, the Amstrad was the one I got, right? So it was the cheaper one, so I went with the Amstrad.
Yeah, it was interesting because the one that I had the experience with when I was a kid was the TRS-80 from Radio Shack, and then my dad surprised me and turned around and said, "I got you an Apple II." Which at that point I was like, well, that's awesome. You got me a computer. I don't know. I was playing with the TRS-80s at Radio Shack, but I took to the Apple at that point, and I've been on that platform, pretty much ever since.
Wow, that's a long time.
But
that was before Apple was Apple.
For me, it was the Apple II, and it was back when Apple was just the Apple computer and nothing else.
Yeah.
But this is an Android show. And I know we're going to be talking a lot about things like Kotlin and such, and I know Jenn has a lot of questions Kotlinized for you. So Jenn, I'm gonna turn things over to you.
Yeah, so I am about beginner intermediate when it comes to Kotlin. I was really immersed in Java. That's what I learned when I did my master's degree and everything else. So I have a lot of questions about Kotlin as I'm getting more entrenched, because I've learned enough to write simple apps, and as I go along, I keep having more and more questions. So I would start out, could you explain the concept of what is a higher order function, and why do we keep seeing these as often in Kotlin as we do?
So by definition, a high order function is a function that takes a function or returns a function. And I think that, especially in the Android world, I don't want to say especially in the Android world, but, a lot of programming languages have been trying to move towards functional approaches and using lambdas to shortcut certain syntaxes, which I think in Android, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an Android developer, and yet I keep ending up on Android shows. But you have event handlers, and the shortcut to implement those event handlers is using lambdas, which is much shorter syntax than the whole implementing a class or an object, etc. So the higher order functions lead to these abilities to create these lambdas, which are kind of like anonymous functions. And so that's why they're kind of popular. And Kotlin, one of the reasons that we actually created Kotlin from day one was because we were lacking this in Java 6 at the time.
That makes perfect sense. And that's another thing. As a professor, I'm often trying to explain the concept of lambda. What is a lambda? And that is such a hard concept to explain. So
Yeah.
I was curious to hear someone like you. I like to get a lot of different takes on that. So I would love to hear, like, what are these lambda things? It seems like they sprang up recently. They're showing up in all the different modern programming platforms. What is a lambda for someone who's getting into this and feeling overwhelmed by that term?
So that person that's getting into it familiar with object orientation, would you say?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, or at least they know what a class is. They should know what an object is. Think of a basic computer science student that's had maybe their first year.
Yeah. So I think then the way that I would is, if you take a look at an object, normally when they talk about objects, you talk about data and behavior. And a lot of times the objects that we implement either end up exclusively being data such, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
If you have an object that you only want to have behavior, you end up basically having a function, right? So then the question is, like, why would I have to create an object, create a class, create an instance of that class, have this function, etc., if all I could just do is just have this function without all of the ceremony of the class, right? So now you can just essentially say, well, why can't I just, declare functions in a file as opposed to have to attach them with classes? Which is great, because then now you can start to use these functions. But sometimes, when you want to pass these functions around, especially to higher order functions, which is functions that take as arguments other functions, you don't even want to define that function. You just want to, do an ad hoc behavior. So why have to go to the extra ceremony of creating this function to just, pass it as an argument to another function if I could just pass the behavior directly? It's the same way as, like, if I want to pass a number 2 to a function, why do I have to declare a variable number 2? I could just pass the number 2. So I would say that lambda is essentially in the same way, right? You're shortcutting the fact that you don't need to declare a function to then pass it to another function. I don't know if that came out well or just completely on a railroad.
It's more difficult sometimes to discuss these concepts without a visual.
Yeah, tell me about it.
But what do you think? Sometimes the term that I use is a headless function, or I love the term anonymous function. But I remember when I started as an Android programmer, thinking how incredibly cool it was just to define the behavior of a button right there in the code, right after you declare the button. And it seems like it's just gotten easier and easier as far as syntax goes, but it's also harder to explain, and it's harder for me to know what are the rules with this language, because it seems like almost anything goes.
I mean, the additional
brackets and start writing my method,
I guess the additional issue that we have with Kotlin is that technically an anonymous function isn't the same as a lambda, which, if you look on Wikipedia or any language that you look at, generally it says, a lambda or anonymous function. But in Kotlin, we actually make a distinction, because you can have a lambda, which is the curly brace, and then the parameters, and then the arrow and the body. Or you can actually have a function which is fun without a name, and then the parameters, and then the body, which is what we call the anonymous function, similar to how you can have anonymous functions in JavaScript. So we additionally make that distinction, which is even more confusing sometimes, I guess.
Wow, I did not know. So now I know not to use those terms interchangeably.
I mean, a lot of people do, it's even myself at times, but technically, like, we do make that distinction. So yeah, it's, for people that come new to it, or come from other languages, they often use this, interchange the terms. Yeah, let's stop this. Let's stop this show for now. Let's just take a 10-minute break and go do that.
We're going to take a break. Oh no. That's what's so fun about Wikipedia. I would love to have a credit for fixing Wikipedia, especially something that good.
Yeah, I once changed HTTP to an HTTPS, and my edit got refused. I'm like, that's it. I'm done.
Oh.
I'm never ever going to do anything on Wikipedia again.
Oh no. Oh, did they have a good reason for rejecting edit?
Do they ever have a good reason? No.
Oh, that's frustrating. That difference, but the interchangeability of terms kind of reminds me of the argument between arguments and parameters.
Yeah, tell me about that one. That is, yeah.
I think I finally understand the difference, at least according to one C++ book author, but I often use them interchangeably. Or function and method. Is there a difference in those terms?
I guess function could not belong to a class, I guess. Method has always kind of been associated to an object, I guess. But, we change those, we use those interchangeably as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it changes with the times. To me, it kind of feels like a trend. Whatever the majority of people are agreeing on right now seems to be what's right. So I like to ask the people whose code style and knowledge base is good. Another concept in Kotlin that I'd like to know more about, or to hear another interpretation on, is unit. So I kind of understand what it is, but is it a substitute for void? Is there a void in Kotlin? And what exactly is unit?
Yeah, so generally the way I explain unit is I say that it's exactly the same as void, except it's completely different. Like the idea is the same, right? You know how in a void is basically a function, or now if we're trying to really be stringent on terms, a procedure. Back in the old days at university, they used to call them procedures, those that didn't return a value, right? Versus function, those that did. So, it would be a procedure. So essentially a function that doesn't return a value, which is void. In Kotlin, the equivalent to void is unit. The difference is that unit is actually a type, and it's essentially implemented as an object. So in Kotlin, you have classes, and then you can create an instance of a class. But then you also have the concept of an object, which is essentially similar to JavaScript. You can just declare object and give it a name, and then that would essentially become a singleton. So a unit is essentially an object called unit, and it has a member, which is a function toString, which returns the string unit. So in all practical effects, when you don't return a type in Kotlin, by default, that type is assumed to be unit. And you can mark it explicitly, or otherwise it's inferred. The difference between that and void is that you can actually assign a value to the return of a function that returns unit. You can query it. You can say, is this a unit? You can invoke toString on it, etc.
That is really cool. So it's nothing, but it's something but it's something.
So we've also got nothing, but let's not go there.
Oh no.
No, really, we do have nothing as well.
Oh, is there really? I haven't encountered that one yet.
There's actually a type called nothing in Kotlin, And I always ask people, I'm like, what is at the, when I'm giving a talk, like, what is at the bottom of the Kotlin type system? And someone would shout out, nothing. And I'm like, exactly, that's right, it's nothing. And there's a type in Kotlin called nothing. And the difference with that, going back to kind of like, I wouldn't say procedure, but the difference with that is that nothing essentially is saying to you that the function will not return, right?
Oh.
So when your function return type is nothing, it means that the function doesn't return, which means that, let's say, for example, let's say that you have a function that throws an exception. If you say the return type is nothing, it won't return.
Wow. That makes sense. And can you think of any other languages that do that? That seems like new behavior altogether.
To be honest with you, I don't know if there's another one that does that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, because I was going to say kind of equivalent to a procedure, but the procedure actually does return, right? It just does execution and returns. I don't know of anyone that does that.
It makes me think back to my assembly days where, a function is essentially addresses on a stack. So my mind's fishing around like, wow, how does that work? Because I would have had to.
That basically halt the application running?
Well, I mean, essentially, yes, but it depends on what you're actually doing in that code, right? The idea there is to kind of give insight also to the compiler and the IDE to tell you whether, for example, there is some potential unreachable code, right? So let's say that let's say that you have a function that prints a line to the standard output. And then above that, you write, throw exception. Generally, most IDEs would detect and say, the line is unreachable. But if you wrap that throw exception into a function that's called, that returns nothing, the compiler won't be able to know that. And the IDE generally doesn't know that either. Now, if you say that that function returns nothing, now it does know that that's returning. However, if in that function you're not actually, throwing an exception, then it wouldn't halt execution.
Oh, wow. That is really interesting.
It's actually a good question I should ask myself. I think it does not halt execution. It would detect that the code is reachable, so it would give you a warning. But it's up to you to halt execution.
Wow. Is that what that function type is usually used for?
Pretty much, yeah. Normally you would do that. I mean, we have a standard function in this. We have a function in the standard library that just basically returns. It's a to do. It's called to do, and it returns nothing. So the idea is that essentially when you create a function called to do and you put a message in there, it's going to tell you that code is unreachable. So that's essentially one of the main usages.
Built-in to-dos that you can use in the editor, because writing tutorials, I use that feature all the time.
Yeah, it's basically built into the standard library. So
that's cool.
But it's also important to understand that whatever that function, you can't just have an empty block with that function, right? Because the function has to return nothing. So it has to actually implement that nothing, which I didn't get into, is a type, right? And it's essentially a class that has a private constructor. So whatever it returns has to implement nothing. So you can't just, while you definitely, the halting execution is in your hand, it's kind of limited what you can actually do from that function, which most of the time will probably end up halting execution.
So nothing's a type, so you actually have to return that type. You have to have something that creates that instance of that type so that it comes back.
Correct. Nothing is essentially a class which has a private constructor. It's called, it's essentially defined as public class nothing and then a private constructor.
Everybody's getting so clever lately. I'm getting return types of nothing, return types of never. It's All the languages are trying to be incredibly clever, and I'm beginning to feel like I'm watching Who's on First.
Yeah, and Kotlin in particular is very intriguing. And Swift and even C# I see following along some of these trends. But Kotlin has some behavior that I've never seen before.
I mean, to be fair, when you look at Kotlin, it is heavily inspired by existing languages such as C#, Kotlin, C#, JavaScript, Scala, Java,
Swift.
Well, technically not so much, because actually I think Swift started 2 months before we did. They made the first public commit. They made the first commit to GitHub, but we went public like several years before Swift was announced.
Oh, I did not know that.
Really? I did not know that. I should know that.
We went, so they actually, their first commit, if we looked at the history, I think it was like 1.5 or 2 months before Kotlin. But they only went public like three or 4 years ago, way after we had already announced Kotlin and we already had some early releases. But yeah, I mean, generally all of them are inspired by other languages anyway, right? And now, for example, C# is getting inspired by Kotlin.
Yep.
So it's great.
I noticed that trend. I love it with the interpreted types. And there are some things these days that, and one thing back in my day, they used to encourage us to use Notepad. And, you don't get the right memorization if you use an IDE that's going to do code generation for you. And now as the next generation teacher, I can see the value of memorization, but we unlearn things as quickly as we learn them, so I think you're better off to learn really good skills leveraging your IDE well than you are to memorize pieces of code that you're only going to see until they update, the language or the platform again.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion. I mean, I work for an IDE company, so
yeah. Nowadays, I'm so thankful for the IDEs that come from your company.
but I do fire up Vim. But full disclosure here, I have heard that argument several times of I don't need, like, first of all, like, the IDE is way more than just code completion, right? But the argument of like, I don't need an IDE to give me a list of methods. I should know this. Well, really? I mean, I personally have a limited amount of space in my brain, and I realize as older as I get, I have to kind of like push something out to put something in. It's like I can't do too many things at once. And like it just makes really no sense. I don't want to waste my life trying to memorize method names on types, etc. Right? It's kind of like, but having said that, I don't know how many of you, like when I was young, I used to know like 10 or 12 or 15 telephone numbers by heart. I know like one now. I don't even know my kids' telephone numbers. I just know my wife's telephone number. That's it. Right. And like the cell phones have essentially moved us away from even knowing telephone numbers. And
that is so true.
Remember, if you want to scare your kids today, you have to tell them that when phone calls came in, we didn't know who was calling, and that should scare them.
Oh, yes. And you could use *69. You just don't answer it, and then you could pick up in *69. We used to, well, that was originally, we would use the payphones and like place a collect call and say, call Jenn at the mall. Hang up real quick and stuff.
Payphones, or as what we like to refer to them, 1970s burners.
And I can so relate. I used to have a Rolodex of phone numbers in my mind, all my friends and their work schedules and where they'd be at a certain time. And nowadays you just shoot texts whenever you don't remember. It's less personal.
Rolodex, for those of you, is a paper version of your contacts app.
That is awesome. Well, so back to Kotlin, and then I really do want to get into this. What is technology? How has that impacted us as a society? But let's see. You mentioned that object is a singleton. So that was a question I had for you. It looks like you answered that pretty well. I was like, what's the difference between object and class? So I love the term singleton that you use. That made it much more clear. Because a lot of times as a coder, I find myself just using these things, just accepting design patterns, but not always really fully understanding why. Another concept that I find myself just using a lot, and I kind of understand it, but the concept of lazy. And I remember way back in Objective-C days, way back, like not even 10 years ago, where there was lazy instantiation. And I wonder, is that similar in Kotlin, this lazy initialization that we've got now?
It's pretty much the same. So lazy essentially is the pattern whereby you essentially initialize a property the first time you access it, and then you can cache the results. And in Kotlin we have the concept of delegated properties, which means that you can delegate the implementation of a property to outside of the class. So built into the standard library, we have a higher order function, which again takes those lambdas, which is called lazy. So you can combine that with property delegation, and then with a single line of code. Oh God, every time I say that, I sound like Microsoft. With a single line of code, you can just essentially implement the entire lazy pattern, right? By just say like val x lazy by, and then the lambda with the behavior of how you want to implement that, and that automatically gets you lazy initialization.
Wow. Sometimes I just really get enthralled with the Kotlin language, because thinking back to the lazy initialization way back with Objective-C, I thought it was cool back then, but you sure had to do a lot more than one line.
That again goes kind of in line with the general philosophy that we've tried to take with Kotlin, which is let's look at the problems that people generally have and how we can address them from the language perspective, tooling, or / standard library approach. And a lot of the way that also Kotlin is designed is that a lot of the functionality is actually delegated to the standard library. It's not part of the language as such. There isn't many keywords. I mean, lazy isn't a keyword in Kotlin. It's just a function of the standard library.
Oh, wow. That is, I had not mentally made that separation before either. That is really cool. And one last question on Kotlin, and this is a big old can of worms, but I am just starting out. I have not used coroutines. So what are coroutines, and what can you tell us about those? And I know that's a giant can of worms, but I know that's also I know that's also a big question. Lots of people are inquiring about those.
To make it, the TLDR of coroutines is that it's our approach to try and do non-blocking programming. If you have your typical Android application or desktop application or whatever, the user does something and then that, it's a longer running process. You don't want to block the main thread, etc. So what we do is use the concept of coroutines, which again dates back, I think, to the 60s or 70s. And essentially the idea is that you have this concept of suspending functions, which are functions that can be suspended and then their execution resumed. So the idea is that you can delegate some functionality to another lightweight thread, because that's also something that's different with coroutines. Like in a general environment, if you take Mac OS for instance, and you launch 100,000 threads, right now, depending on your version of Mac OS, it won't give you an out of memory exception, because Mac OS actually plays a nice little trick, which is it won't launch threads until it has enough memory. But those 100,000 threads aren't going to take let's say if you launch 100,000 threads to sleep at 1 second, it's not going to take 1 second or 2 seconds. It's going to take a long, long time, right? Because Mac OS is trying to limit the number of threads that it can launch so as to not cause a out of memory exception. On other systems, that could perfectly lead to an out of memory exception. And that's because you launch these heavyweight threads and you're going to try and launch all of these and keep all of these. And then there's a context switching, there's a whole bunch of stuff. With coroutines, what you're doing is you're launching kind of like lightweight threads, meaning that you're just basically launching these suspend functions, and these suspend functions aren't taking up any space or anything. And when they need to resume, they will resume. So if you take that same experiment and you launch 100,000 coroutines on Mac, it essentially print out in a few seconds and it's done. It's over, right? And you can scale that up to 1 million. So it's like lightweight threads used for non-blocking programming.
So like the async pattern, basically?
Yes. It's essentially kind of like the async pattern or the futures pattern. The difference is, again, that, a lot of that functionality, like if you take C#, C# has async await, right?
Yeah.
And it's built-in keywords to the language. With Kotlin, we don't have that. With Kotlin, we have async await, but they're not actually keywords. They're, again, library functions. Under the covers, we are using the concept of coroutines, which is essentially I execute a function, suspend it, resume it when I need it. And all of this is implemented. Another important aspect of it is that all of this is done at the compiler level using a state machine, meaning that it doesn't require to have specific primitives on specific platforms. So for instance, on JavaScript, you can't have threads. So basically everything is done through the event loop model. On Java, you can have threads. On .NET, you can have threads. So with coroutines, it's independent of the platform. We can pretty much provide you the same experience throughout any platform you use.
Oh, wow. That is really cool.
So let's turn from Kotlin for a minute. Now, you are at JetBrains leading the developer advocacy team.
Yes.
So what does the developer advocacy team do at JetBrains?
That's a good question. Let me check. I'll be right back.
I try my best.
No, it's I mean, I assume you're familiar with developer advocacy, or are you specifically asking around?
Well, let's start with the definition of developer advocacy from your point of view.
Okay, so developer advocacy essentially, again, the summary of it is basically being kind of like the bridge, somewhat of the bridge between the community and the development teams and the company. So our job involves helping people. I like to always say, like, the main goal of our job is to make people, developers, more efficient at what they're doing. And that could be through the use of teaching them tools, technologies, our tools, maybe sometimes not our tools, but our goal is to educate people and developers in particular to be better at what they're doing. That is the main job description of a developer advocate. And it's also as a part of that is also for us to learn from developers, see where they struggle, and try and give that feedback to the product teams in order to help improve the situation. Right.
So there really is the two sides to it. There's the outreach to the developers to make it work better for them, but there's also the input from the developers to help grow the product.
Correct. And we're just, we're one aspect of the input. Obviously, there's the feedback that the product teams get through market trends, through research, through issues voted on our issue tracker, which in the case of JetBrains, we've always had public issue trackers, feedback that we get through other means. So we're just one part of that equation, right? But a lot of times we have closer contact with individual developers or people that are, doing certain innovative things in the community or certain companies, etc. So we're more kind of like that personal contact. And then the tasks that we do, how we accomplish that, then largely depends on the advocate, largely depends on the company. For us, it involves speaking at conferences. It involves being at booths at conferences to talk to customers. It involves customer meetings. It involves creating tutorials in written format, in screencasts, podcasts, anything basically that we could help educate developers.
But you yourself, you host Talking Kotlin.
Correct, yeah. So I do the Talking Kotlin podcast and speaking and stuff like that. I
used your blog post about public speaking to help me get some tips today. So I really liked your blog, and I noticed that you were learning how to play guitar as well.
Yes, and all I've been doing is looking at that guitar since we've been on. And you know how to play?
I know enough chords to play a Bob Dylan song or two.
Oh, wow, nice. Yeah.
But yeah, I just know your basic G, D, and E minor, A minor. And I have another Fender Strat there too, so that one belongs to my daughter. But she knows more than I do.
If you notice mine.
Oh, nice.
It's left-handed, so it's completely the reverse.
Oh wow!
So, which is good and bad, because when I go to places and they're like, "Hey, do you know how to play the guitar?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm learning. I could definitely play." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You only have right-handed guitars, and I need a left-handed guitar, so I don't look like a fool."
I'm always pleased when I at least get some of this information, because when I look at the bios for a lot of the people who come on the show, it's like, I've been coding since this age and I code like this, and in my spare time I code. It's like, come on, there's got to be something you do when you put the keyboard down. I put the keyboard down and I pick up a guitar.
Yeah. It's actually funny because for so many years, I started to learn how to play the guitar when I was 20, and I learned for about 1 year with a right-handed guitar, and I gave up because I thought that because I'm left-handed, I thought I'll never be good. And then I picked it up about 1.5 years ago again with left-handed. And but so many times in my life, I'm like, I don't have time to do this. I just don't have time. And last year I said, you know what, I'm just going to pick it up and I'm going to dedicate like half an hour to it a day. And it's incredible when you kind of like have this determination of, no, I'm going to dedicate half an hour. You actually make time for stuff and not manage to really fall behind on other things.
Mm. That is good. That's good advice. I tell my students too, it's about practice. So I'm trying to take my own advice in that realm, and like, I'm going to do so much a day on learning Kotlin is one of the things, or Android development is one. I'd like to practice guitar, but mastery only comes through practice. There is not an easy way. There's no perfect prescription that's just going to make it come overnight.
So speaking about the practice and making this a lot easier over time, I think we can hold on there for a few moments. And Jenn has got some shortcuts to finding her way through Android Studio. We'll talk about some of that in the second half. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to hear from our sponsor, TripleByte, and then we'll be right back right after this. This RayWenderlich.com podcast is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on phone screens, take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your interest or your cover letters. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help.
They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you get to go straight to the final interviews with the companies on their platform. It's like the common app for software engineers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code.
And I can appreciate that. Being in the industry for 35 years, I'm entirely self-taught. My undergraduate study was in theater, and I left school to do my first job, so I don't carry a bachelor's, no bachelor's of arts, no bachelor's of science, and that's the one thing I'm often trying to hide or misdirect on my resume. With TripleByte, they'd care more about the coding experience that I have and not worry about that one little fact.
Apply now at triplebyte.com/Ray. That's triplebyte.com, byte, BYTE, as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
And again, a special thanks to TripleByte for sponsoring this episode and this season of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Back in with section 2 for this show, and it looks like Jenn is going to help us find our way around Android Studio the quick and easy way, or at least find shortcuts that help us operate more efficiently. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about Android Studio and why this?
Thanks, Dru. Thanks very much. One of the things that I am currently working on to enhance my skill set is I would like to learn more keyboard shortcuts in general. I was watching one of Hadi's YouTube videos. Of course, being with IntelliJ, there was a YouTube about IntelliJ tips and tricks and shortcuts. And I really admire people who can use quick keys well, because when you're presenting or giving a talk about code, and I often have to demonstrate code either in talks or in front of a class, people just look really professional and knowledgeable when they can do those shortcuts and they're not always reaching for their mouse. That's an area where I'm a little disadvantaged, mainly because of my typing skills. I have typing skills that are really good. I type about 120 words a minute. I can do that at 100% accuracy for an extended period of time.
Nice.
But one area I'm lacking is quick keys. My typing skills have allowed me to ignore things like stepping code. And these days, with modern IDEs being so incredibly powerful, I could really leverage that to be a faster developer. And it makes the audience, when you're removing lines of code and moving methods up and down, the audience is just like, wow. And they can focus more on what you're saying. You don't have a long pause between, okay, I'd like to change the code this way. You take 5 or 6 seconds, they've forgotten the context.
I really appreciate that, because I'm just beginning to transition from being programmer to being public speaker. Not so much in the podcast, but actually going to conferences and speaking. And I also have always been just amazed at these people who say, now we're going to drop in this little code bite that I already had previously done, or we're just going to add this and this. And I know that as a programmer, I program fairly fine. And then all of a sudden it's like, and mouse. And then I program some and mouse. So I really am pleased to hear that this is a way to transition to make that much more quick. If you were to break it down, which areas would you specifically focus on as far as this is for speeding up your key usage?
I think where I would start is moving code around. So a lot of times I grab my mouse, I highlight a line, I cut. So I use most people, I won't say everybody, because on a daily basis, I encounter people that don't know how to cut and paste. But most people know the quick keys to cut and paste. And then you put your cursor where you want to put the code and paste it. And sometimes you have to highlight a section and so forth. So for moving code around, there are some quick keys for that. Yeah, so for shifting code up and down, and I'm going to use Mac OS key shortcuts for this, but Option Shift up arrow and down arrow will allow you to shift a line of code.
And obviously we'll have all of these in the show notes, because we don't expect people to be taking notes during the show, but we'll have all of these shortcuts that you're going to talk about in the notes.
Yes, and one of the guides I used as one of my primary sources is an article from our site. So hopefully we can link to that article. And I also just looked around on the documentation and all different sources, but we have a great article on the site about that. So you can shift code up and down that way using, for Windows and Linux, it would be Shift Alt up and down arrow. And that way you can move a line of code. And it looks like you just have to have your cursor on the line with it. And so that's really nice. You can move lines up and down. And you can also move an entire method. So that made me so happy, because just recently I was writing a big program. It's got like a data adapter and everything. So there's, more than a dozen methods in there. And I kept reordering my methods. And so you can move methods around by using shift command instead of shift option. And that'll take an entire method up or down in between other methods. So that's really handy. If you've done like me, I will be lazy and I'll insert all my methods at the top of my program, and my onCreate just sinks down to the bottom. And of course I want that at the top. So now I can just quick key that to the top. I don't have to sloppily grab my mouse and.
So I think that definitely is great, but I would suggest maybe if you want to even look at reformatting code. I don't know if you use that, because then that way you don't even have to move your methods around.
Oh,
so
nice.
Yeah, so you can have basically, you can write anything you want, and then just, it very much depends on what your preferences is on how you want to sort your methods, your properties, etc. But code formatting is quite flexible. It has a lot of options. So you can just write functions and anything, anywhere you want, and then just say reformat code, and then that will clean it all up for you for the entire file or for the entire project.
That is great. I have used that feature. I didn't know that it would reorder the methods like that too.
It should, unless I'm mistaken, but it definitely should. Arrangement. Yes, I think you can set how to arrange fields and file method name, etc.
Oh, great. And then I have a cheat sheet in front of me, and it looks like you can do that with Control-Alt-L or Command-Option-L.
Yes.
So you quick key that one too.
Yeah.
So that's pretty awesome. I loved seeing your demonstration. You were using a quick key to go into the settings, and then you were setting your code formatting settings right with your keyboard. So from an audience standpoint, that was blowing me away watching you do that. So that was really cool. There's also a quick key to duplicate a line of code, Command D. So very often I'm highlighting Control-C, Control-V. So there's a lot of times I'm doing way more work than I need to. Same with deleting code. You can Control-Y or Command backspace on that to delete a line of code. That would be a lot better. And the renaming, I always find myself doing a right click on a variable, going to refactor, rename. I didn't realize that you could use Shift F6 for that. So that is very handy. You can rename a variable, a method, a class. It looks like if you use Control F6, you can change a whole method signature with that. So there's a feature I'll probably incorporate in my day-to-day usage.
Yeah, and if you have a Mac, you can use that horrible thing at the top, which is called the touch bar, which I really do not like.
The touch bar. So is that essentially where the function keys are at? I use a Mac, but I don't know Mac terminology.
Yeah, so the newer MacBooks, they have the touch bar at the top. So they basically got rid of the physical function keys, and they added that display that is like it can change. So in IntelliJ and Android Studio, obviously, we've adapted to that. So you don't have to like press Shift F6, for instance. If you're on a method name or a variable name, the touch bar already displays rename, refactor.
Oh,
personally, though, I just can't get used to it. So I keep pressing the function key, which brings back the F keys, and then I invoke the F keys. Right?
Apple really wanted to put some kind of iPhone-ish, iDevice-ish type in there, and it's pseudo works, but I find it's become more of a toy than anything else. I haven't learned my quick keys, and it's almost like, well, if you know all your quick keys, then you're gonna love what we give you in the touch bar, but you haven't learned all your quick keys, so you don't realize that the touch bar is actually helping you with that.
Yeah. And the worst part is that it doesn't have any kind of feedback. So I've installed a little tool, which is called Haptic or something like that, that when you press it, it goes like tick-tock like this, similar to how the actual keyboard sounds, but you don't get any touch feedback on it, which is annoying.
That would be difficult as a touch typist. Would be difficult for me to not know if I hit the right key. I still have an old-fashioned, I thought it was so up to date, but I went in through the settings. I can't stand the FN key. Like, that drives me insane. So I went into my Mac settings on all my Macs, and now the F keys are default. So there's a setting in your Mac, depending on which kind, there's different ways to get there. And that way you don't have to hold down the FN key. And that'll make keyboard shortcuts more realistic for me, because the FN key drives me bonkers. I'm clear back from the days of when I started learning computers, and I was 16. I was working for temp agencies and stuff, and I was doing dictation typing with the command line WordPerfect. And they had the card on the function keys, and you had different function keys for bold. And so the function keys are close to my heart. I don't like having to hold FN.
Yeah, I kind of fell off of the touch bar, but that's predominantly because what I tend to do is I tend to have my laptop to the side. I have it docked to a larger monitor, and then I have a Bluetooth keyboard that actually has all of the keys on it. Yeah, and with the Bluetooth keyboard, they haven't put a touch bar on it, so you basically have your F keys again. Though I do miss the days of function key card cutouts, where you basically would have your cheat sheet right at your function keys. I really did like that. I thought it was a great idea, because you're touching, you look down and go, oh, there's that shortcut.
Now there is a great idea. I should make one for Android Studio shortcuts and distribute it, and you could print it out and cut it out and make it for all the standard size keyboards.
I actually think they do have some. That there's a site that generates these for Vim, for Android, for IntelliJ platform, and for a bunch of other ones.
So I'm going to have to put you on the list now, because you've said Vim 3 times and you haven't said that there's Emacs. So obviously we know where you stand on that.
Oh dear. I'm so sorry.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'm Vim. I'm not Emacs.
Oh gosh. And some of the shortcut keys that I knew about that I liked to use all the time, that I'm surprised I come across people every day that don't know that they can block indent. So I'm sure many of our listeners do know that, but the fact that you can highlight and use control square brackets left and right to block indent your code, and on Windows it's tab and shift tab. If I couldn't block indent, I might just have some tears over that. And I've always used, so very first, if you can only have one shortcut key in Android Studio, I would go with Alt-Enter. So I often, when I have no idea what shortcut I'm supposed to use, I try Alt-Enter just in case.
What does that do?
It does auto import a lot. So a lot of times as you're typing code, if you don't have your setting to auto import the libraries you need, Alt-Enter will pop up a menu that you can choose the right import file. So it saves some time. Or if there's ambiguity. So if you have 2 imports that are in different class namespaces, and you might have to Alt-Enter and pick between the 2.
I'm really pleased with square bracket, because I find that's on just about every editor. It's in Xcode as well. Obviously, command, option, shift, control. You have to find the right one for your IDE, but square bracket, both indenting and exdenting, outdenting, whatever it is. But what was that?
No, I don't know. I was going to say unindenting, but I don't even know if that's correct.
But square bracket is always great, because you're always trying to match your code, especially if you're on a team where you've got multiple people. You want to make sure everything matches up, and your preferences might not necessarily match the way the code is. But that square bracket denting is, denting is a godsend.
The Alt-Enter actually does, like, Alt-Enter is one of the more famous keyboard shortcuts of the platform, which basically does a whole bunch of different things based on the context. So a lot of the times, if you're looking at your code in Android Studio and you see a little squiggly, you hit Alt-Enter and it says, well, there's an issue and here's a quick fix to fix it. So based on the context, Alt-Enter does a lot of things. And it's good that you highlight that keyboard, because one of the keyboard shortcut, because one of the things that we're trying to do heavily, and we've done it in some of our other tools, is to try and consolidate a lot of the functionality in a single keyboard shortcut. So we're trying to bring more and more things that you can do through Alt-Enter and make it contextual so that people don't have to remember all of these other keyboard shortcuts. But if I were to mention the Shift Command A, which is definitely the keyboard shortcut everyone should know about, because that is basically allows you to look up anything you want without knowing the keyboard shortcut. So that's essentially to execute an action. And if you don't know how to refactor something, you write refactor, and then you can invoke the refactor action, or you can just look up the keyboard shortcut on it as it's displayed.
That's nice.
Now that is really cool. I'm writing that one down. I've noticed as a teacher, because I know about Alt-Enter, I end up telling my class that, and it amazes me because oftentimes they do end up using that to fix their own syntax errors, or sometimes they get some really creative, they'll create a class, or they'll start using the IDE tools to generate code for them. And so I really like that shortcut key because it's always a great discussion point in class. And sometimes it leads a total beginner, like someone who's never really coded or used an IDE much. It'll lead them to their own solutions or down a rabbit hole of learning. So I love how it kind of guides you through these days.
Well, the big rabbit hole question I always have is, in some cases I have a key combination I'm used to in one or a series of apps that differs. Does Android Studio allow you to personalize those keys? In other words, I know that the default set of keys is set, but I need to actually have it be something else.
Yeah, but it totally does. I mean, you can essentially configure anything you want. Any action, you can define the keyboard mapping for it. And in fact, if you go to the help menu in Android Studio or IntelliJ and you click key map references, that opens up a PDF with the keyboard shortcuts for the different layouts, which is an A4 which you can print and put on your desk. And if you have custom keyboard shortcuts, that PDF will generate your custom keyboard shortcuts for you. So it's not just the standard ones.
That's nice.
That's great. It's great. So if you have an old favorite, you can include that in your IDE.
That actually really kills me with me because I use Slack and a bunch of other tools, and Command K is to search. And Command K in IntelliJ is the commit dialog box. So every time I go back to IntelliJ, I'm like, okay, let me look for a type, and I press Command K, and the commit dialog box comes up. I'm so used to using Command K.
Oh no, that's crazy.
I think Emacs has Command K as well. No, you see, I mentioned Emacs there.
Oh gosh. And you mentioned search. One thing that I do all the time is search, and I'd never noticed until I watched your video that is right under my nose that you can press shift twice. And when you open up your Android Studio IDE, there's some tips written right there. And it's so classic of a developer to have been using an IDE for years and never actually read the text that's on the screen.
It almost feels like, go ahead.
No, people normally, when we first introduced the double shift, we were like, why don't you blog about this stuff? I'm like, when you open up Android Studio or IntelliJ, it's staring you in the face. It's like literally there. We don't need to blog about it. It's there in your face. So
I always opt in on tips and tricks as well. And, gosh, if I remember to read those, and intentions are always good. But I guess we just get focused on tunnel vision on a task. But yes, pressing the shift key twice allows you to search things. So that's really cool. Searching is a big part of my repertoire. I'm
thinking about my IDE, and I'm like, I think I've just been afraid to look because I know that when I look in the keyboard setup that there's got to be at least 300 of these key commands. And I should just sit down and do a project and effectively tie one hand behind my back and not let myself use the mouse if I can help it.
That
Now,
normally,
go ahead.
I was going to say, normally what I do is I really, and this is not a joke, I really recommend to people to completely unplug the mouse when they're using IntelliJ. Like literally do not touch the mouse or the touchpad. Just stop using it for a while. And it's the best way to learn to basically get more efficient at the keyboard.
We will all, that's a really good suggestion. And I have some plugins I want to discuss too, but there is a plugin called Key Promoter X that says it will pop up an annoying pop-up every time you use the mouse for something that there's a shortcut key for. So unplugging the mouse would certainly do a thorough job of that as well. I was going to try that Key Promoter X plugin, and it says it will help you to train yourself to use keyboard shortcuts more often than your mouse. It'll display an annoying pop-up every time you perform an action with your mouse. And it'll also list how many times you've done that action.
Oh, I so need that for my IDE.
And, you know, it was Mac people who inspired me to want to know keyboard shortcuts, because if you've ever seen someone who's really good at Photoshop, and that's where I got inspired with this idea, was watching a friend teach a Photoshop class, and he's never using his mouse. And I was like, wow, I wish I was that good at shortcut keys. Xcode and Mac has a lot of them. And for me, I'm across 3 different IDEs, so it's going to be a lot of memorization. But Android Studio is the one I use the most. And I also use PyCharm to teach my introduction to programming. So that'll help me look cool in 2 classes.
Well, while all the specific key commands that you're giving are going to be specific to Android Studio, a lot of these concepts of finding the search, finding the ways to learn them, and finding ways to use them, they're effective for every IDE, from IntelliJ to Android to Xcode. So this is all really valuable stuff.
Yeah, and if you could, I love the JetBrains IDEs. I see students grabbing those every chance they get. So we use PyCharm. We use PyCharm because as a developer, I think we all have our little quirks. And one of my quirks is that if I can't have line numbers, I just can't. So I installed PyCharm, and we use that one because idle won't let you display. That's the built-in IDE with Python. That won't let you display line numbers down the left, or if it does, I sure can't figure it out. So I moved them right into an IDE and intro to programming.
When I go retro and I have to actually print my source code, I'm using a BB Edit on the Mac, which is this wonderful, it's a text-only editor. It's not an IDE, though it has some code completion features. It has some of the best grep that I've ever dealt with in a visual editor. But one of the things it does is have some fantastic printing setup so that I can get line numbers, I can get borders around it, I can actually change the number and layout. So I love it, but I because I can have the line numbers and I can do quick commands, go to line number is one of the really big helpful things there.
Oh, nice. Do we have a go-to line number in IntelliJ?
Yep. You can either just invoke the keyboard shortcut directly, or if you are on a file, for instance, if you open up a file, so you can press Shift Command O, for instance, to go to a file. And if you put the name of the file, or start typing the name of the file and then colon and then a number, that will take you to that line number on that file. So you can navigate directly to that.
Cool. That is really cool. So do you, Hadi, do you have any favorite shortcut keys you'd want to share with us? Because I kind of listed the ones I've been.
I favor the Shift Command A, which is find action, because nice. I think that is that, like, I use that a lot because I don't know all the keyboard shortcuts for everything either. So if I don't know a keyboard shortcut, I never try and use the mouse and go to the menu. I just press Shift Command A, start to type what I want, and then that will take me to execute the action. The other one that I generally like to use is the new one that we introduced recently, which is the double control. And the double control,
really?
it's essentially allows you to run this anything. So you can run, for example, a Gradle task, or you can run a Maven task or whatever, and it lists through the things that you've run recently, so you can rerun them. So
I will have to try that one too.
yeah, those are some of those are the main two that I essentially are using all the time.
Now,
Oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure if this works with a Java-based app, but I know that if you turn the accessibility on a Mac on, you actually can invoke the menus by keyboard command. You just basically, once accessibility is on, you can say activate menu and then slide the menus across, slide the menus down. So you're effectively turning your keyboard into a keyboard version of the mouse, which is sort of a cheat halfway in between, but it's also there for people who have motion limitations. So it is effectively another way to get a keyboard into the actions.
Yeah, the Swing also has a lot of issues with some of the stuff with accessibility, but I think that in particular works well.
That's really cool. I had not thought of doing that. And then, so as far as keyboard shortcuts, that's as far as I've gotten. But I love the advice for, was it Shift Command A?
Shift Command A or Shift Control A on Windows.
Shift Control A.
Also, you want to open up there's a menu that no one ever goes to. It's called Help on the right.
Yeah, that's like asking for directions. Programmers don't do that.
Yeah. And there's an entry there. It's called Productivity Guide, which is really, again, another example of how, as developers, we're not very good at naming things. And the Productivity Guide is essentially, if you click on it, it shows you a whole bunch of features in terms of, so it lists each feature, the number of times you've used it, and the last time you used it. And then you can sort that by, for example, used, and then see all the ones that are never. And then as you click on them, it gives you hints on how to actually use this, right? And I also say to people, like, every time that someone says, I want to buy IntelliJ and my boss doesn't let me, I'm like, look at the Productivity Guide, multiply the number of times you've used the feature by the number of seconds that it takes that you would have done that manually, and say, look, I just saved you $10,000 this month. So just, go and pay the $5 and buy this. So.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I was in that situation. And for me, I work at a community college. And so I work for a base of hardworking students that are oftentimes challenged income-wise. So I would always use what was free if I could. So I was thrilled when Android Studio hit the scene, because prior to that, of course, Android development was being done with Eclipse. We'd have to install a plugin. Prior to that, my very first Android app, I did it all manually. I was using the build tools on the command line to load up my first Hello World on a rooted device way back with Gingerbread. And when you see what goes into deploying an app, I have a deep appreciation for my IDE.
But to let you know that I don't know if you're aware, but we have a student program at JetBrains, which we give out all of our products for free to students. So we've been giving out, I think, nearly 1.5 million licenses for free to students and academic institutions. So definitely you might want to look into that, or anyone else listening.
That is great. I will too. And I think I know that my students have been leveraging, I know they're all running around using PyCharm. So many of them, we might already be utilizing that. But I know that a lot of the students have heard of JetBrains when they come, and they're really happy to use an IDE. And I know that back when I was a Java developer, I used to wish that I could use IntelliJ instead of Eclipse for the same reason. And nothing against Eclipse. It's just that IntelliJ had such cool features that we were jealous.
Jenn, you'd mentioned Key Promoter X is one of the plugins. Did you have any other plugins that you've been using?
I noticed one that looked really cool. The Neon Cat had some progress bars. Looked like it had progress bars for when the Gradle was building, and so I'm excited to try that one. Sublime Text is another editor that is really common. I know a lot of people use that one. I use Visual Studio Code because it's free. But there's a plugin called Code Glance. And the one thing about Sublime Text that I always notice and like is that panel on the right-hand side that shows you like a bird's eye view of your code. So you can navigate, really high or low in the code. So that the Code Glance puts that navigation pane on the right-hand side of your IntelliJ IDE. So that looked pretty cool. ADB Wi-Fi says it lets you debug your Android apps over Wi-Fi. So I'm gonna have to try that because that might be nice. That would save me getting out of my chair to go fish out a cable. And then, and the thing that just really blew my mind when I was watching one of Hadi's YouTube videos was I might be a little behind the times, but I had never heard of font ligature before. And so when I saw you type the double equals and the not equals, and it actually drew a very beautiful symbol rather than the exclamation point equals, or a really pretty arrow, and you could use the Fira code font, that I'm going to install immediately because I can't wait to look at that closer. So I'd never seen those beautiful fonts before. That totally blew my mind.
And Andre, for you, we do also have an Emacs IDEA plugin with a lot of Emacs features to IDEA. Because there's actually IDEA Vim, which does the same for Vim, but there's an Emacs one as well.
Well, I haven't used I haven't really used terminal-based editing in quite some time because I've really shifted over to BB Edit for most of my text editing in that situation. I kid about the Emacs Vim wars, but they're so far in the past for me.
Oh, people still have them.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I know they're still going on. That pops up in the show notes at least 2 to 3 times a season.
Oh no.
Do you have any Hadi, do you have any plugins that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I use sometimes I use IDEA Vim. There's a good one that I like, which is really silly, but it's called I like it. It's called the Neon Cat.
Yeah,
you mentioned
that one.
I might have mispronounced neon or neon. I called it neon.
The presentation assistant also, which highlights the keyboard shortcuts that you're using. And then there's another one, which is Metrics Reloaded, which gives you a whole bunch of information about the your code in terms of, like, for example, the class coupling, afferent, inferent coupling, efferent and afferent coupling. So that gives you statistics on your code base as well, cyclomatic complexities, etc. So those are the main ones that I usually use.
Nice.
Yeah, I'd add into that right now, but unfortunately in my world right now, my IDE is sort of in massive beta as the new OS is just released at the Apple Developer Conference. So things are sort of in flux, and you don't really see a lot in the way of Xcode plugins because they just change that so often now.
It's also very limited. Like, Xcode's extensibility is extremely limited, which is one of the reasons that we didn't make a plugin for Xcode, and we have our app code IDE, right? Mm-hmm. For iOS development, because it's just so limited what you can or cannot do with Xcode.
And it's not really documented.
No, and it's not very extensible friendly either. Like, I think that Apple does great things, but when it comes to developer relations, it doesn't seem like they're as open at times than not with their tools. Yeah.
I would love to hear Hadi talk about what we were duck walking to earlier, like what is technology doing to us as a society? But
yeah, so I gave a keynote earlier this year, which is called "Welcome to the Machine," and I don't know if you're familiar with Pink Floyd.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and I talk a little bit about the issue that we have with the information overload. I don't know if either of you have read a book by Neil Postman. It was called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is also another album by Roger Waters. And in it, he talks about, how TV and radio is inundating us with so much information that the relevant stuff is being lost in irrelevance. And now even more so with the internet and with social media, and now we've got the additional stuff of fake news and stuff. So yeah, for me it's a really interesting and passionate topic that I've been diving into lately quite a bit.
We may have to have you back on the show to discuss that at length.
Yeah. That's not a 5-minute thing.
That's not a 5-minute thing.
Yeah, it reminds me of Brave New World. So I haven't read that particular book, but I've heard about Brave New World.
So yeah, and actually Neil, what he was saying, he's like, while everyone thought that 1984 was going to be, it's actually more feels like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Unfortunately for us, it feels like they were actually both right, because we're getting a little bit of everything. So.
Yeah, 1984 is where you get policed to death, right? And Big Brother. Yeah. And then Brave New World is where people just stop voluntarily they stop looking for information. Their laziness and complacency they voluntarily go into some.
This really could be an entire topic unto itself, but I think we've gotten a lot of information today, both on Kotlin, Hadi, from you, and talking about some of the ways to more efficiently get through your IDEs in shortcuts and in learning methods. This has been really helpful. Hadi, I really appreciate you being on the show today.
It was great being here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we've got another show coming up in about 2 weeks. That will be Romain Guy that'll be on with us in 2 weeks. And Romain is quite the person. Jenn, you had a couple of comments about who Romain is.
Oh yes, I saw him on stage at Google I/O. So he's a Google engineer. I know that he takes beautiful pictures of photography. So you might have seen some of his photography if you have a Chromecast. And yes, very well-known Google engineer.
So
I think he knows a little bit of Android as well.
just a little.
Just a little about Android UI development. And
we'll have him on in about 2 weeks. Until then, that's going to wrap things up for this episode of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Again, we always like to thank TripleByte, our sponsor. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E, for sponsoring this in pretty much every episode this season. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. Until then, we go back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.